Good morning, everyone. Hopefully you can hear me. My name is Richard Harris, and thanks for joining us today. Just as we explore a little bit of a real monitoring case study through one of our Australian clients, Carol Robbins. My name is Richard Harris. Hopefully you can all hear me. I look after Australia and New Zealand territories. I'm using Francois' account, so there's the confusion. Athlete monitoring has been really the domain of professional sports up until the last couple of years. More recently, however, more affordability and more evidence-based, it's filtered into the junior and youth sub-elite channels. I think most coaches, strength and conditioning and medical people understand the potential and feel they should be doing something. It's just a matter of how and where to start. Education is an area we are committed to spending more time on. The efficiency of software and apps platforms is more and more compelling. So today I'm delighted to welcome an insight from our client, Carol Robbins, as I say, who has spent 12 months implementing monitoring with an academy football program. Carol is an exercise physiologist with a real passion for football and youth development. We'll aim to spend 30 minutes today, and we'll offer contact details at the end if there's any questions you'd like to ask, rather than going into Q&A where I think there's often an awkward silence. So without further ado, I'll try and transfer the screen over to Carol, and the field is yours. And thank you for your time today, Carol.
Thanks, Richard, for the introduction. I'm excited to be presenting my first webinar today with you all and sharing my experience in using athlete monitoring to manage player welfare. The presentation will very much cover my first-hand experience in terms of the challenges I've faced, how I've gone about gaining player and coach buy-in with the app, as well as the sort of data I've been interested in collecting. So firstly, with that being said, we'll get underway, and before I do get started, I just want to give you a bit of an introduction about me. So I'm an accredited exercise physiologist with a background in sports performance, and I've also attained my Football Federation, so my FFA conditioning licence back in 2015. I've spent the last 10 years working within amateur, academy and representative youth football or soccer, from anywhere between under 6s to under 16s. So that in itself has been quite a challenge sometimes. In working in particular with representative teams, my interests have been centred on football-specific fitness, conditioning and injury management at training, especially with the older age groups, so more of the under 15s to 16s. And in 2015, the team I was working with sustained no soft tissue injuries as a result of our training methods, and were also crowned the New South Wales Premier League champions. So since then, and particularly in the last 12 months, as Richard said, I've been working with Football South Coast representative under 13s to 16s youth boys teams, implementing the above mentioned conditioning and injury management with the assistance of athlete monitoring. And before I continue, please don't think that you require any of the above qualifications that I have or an in-depth knowledge of injury management to be able to effectively utilise athlete monitoring. The beautiful thing about this program is that you can tailor it to give you the information that you were interested in only, and hopefully by the end of this presentation you will see that in monitoring youth players in particular, it comes down to keeping things basic. So moving on and getting stuck into it, why did I want to use athlete monitoring? Well, given my background, absolutely, I was looking for ways to keep track of player training loads, wellness data and risk of injury at an individual player, team and club level. This was out of curiosity, wanting to see if those training methods that I've employed in the past previously was assisting in, were being reflected in the data we were collecting from our players from an injury management and conditioning perspective. In addition, and more valuable than what we expected, was that athlete monitoring has become a very powerful tool and a useful way of allowing our players to communicate their understanding of training content, their interpretation of game day performances, and to also raise any questions or concerns that they've had in regards to training but haven't felt comfortable in discussing them in front of their teammates, or are too shy to mention to their coaches in person, despite us highly encouraging this. So through the app's comments section and the ability to generate player questionnaires, this has become one of the most powerful yet simplistic tools for us in using athlete monitoring, and allowed for myself and the coaching staff at Football South Coast to engage and communicate with our players on another level. So like I mentioned before, data collection doesn't have to be made complicated with younger age groups, and it's the feedback, it's their comments that we have found and we received from our players through the app, which has allowed us to adapt and adjust our program in some of the most effective ways without even having yet looked at any raw data or statistics that the app is providing us with. So absolutely, please keep this in mind, especially when dealing with youth players. So moving on. So how did I gain player and coach buy-in? Obtaining this was our number one challenge, and compliance rates was our number one challenge, especially when we began rolling it out during pre-season. So ways in which I tried to gain player and parent buy-in was through an initial email where I introduced them to the reasons behind why we had decided to begin using the app and the potential benefits that this could have for us throughout the season. Another selling point was the mention that Sydney FC was also on board with the program. So this caught the attention and interest of our players in particular. So briefly, for those of you who are perhaps overseas, Sydney FC plays in Australia's National A-League competition and were crowned the 2017 champions and rated as the most successful team in the A-League's 10-year history so far. And as we don't yet have an A-League team of our own down here on the South Coast, a lot of our players follow Sydney FC and are fans. So it gave them a bit of a buzz knowing they were using the same sort of software that a professional A-League team was also using. Finally, providing an interactive tutorial for players and parents on how to use the app was what also assisted a large majority of the players who weren't becoming compliant in starting to use it. So during this tutorial, I took them each through how to complete their daily wellness questionnaire, enter their responses for their team training log, record their own training sessions, and finally, how to report an injury. So next, moving on to the coaches. Here, gaining some of the coaches' buy-in, to be honest, was just as difficult. It wasn't until 3 months into the season did I decide to feed injury statistics that had been recorded by players through the app that two of our coaches started to come on board in particular. It was only then that these guys started to become compliant. This was not only with regards to the app, but our training model, which also, as previously mentioned, has a conditioning and injury prevention focus. Without athlete monitoring, we would have not have had the tangible stats and graphs to emphasise to these guys that their training methods were having a direct impact on their players' high injury rates. And I'm very pleased to say that following on from this intervention, these guys began to following our training model more closely, and the injury statistics for the remaining half of the season dropped significantly. So in saying that, I'd now like to refer to the following two slides and the graphs involved in these. So if you look at the under 13s and 14s, these two coaches were quite on board with our training models, and we strongly believe that this was reflected in their training related injuries. So as you can see here, the under 13s only had 2 reported injuries and the under 14s had none. So even though it says football and soccer injuries were sort of 8 and 5 and 10 and 13, these were being reported outside of our training, so whether or not it was during gameplay or any football or soccer performed outside of our Football South Coast training. So a lot of these kids do play soccer or football at school as well, or do other private academy programs. So moving on to the under 15s and 16s, so these were the guys that weren't as compliant. You can see that the players that reported injuries as occurring at training are quite significant and high. So 8 in the under 15s and 7 in the under 16s. And as I mentioned previously, these are the guys that weren't compliant with our training model. So if you need evidence to back up your data, to back up why you're doing what you're doing at training, this was really helpful. And as you can see on the next slide, that after giving this information and those exact graphs back to our under 15s and 16s coaches, this was when they started to realise and get on board with our training models and using the app more closely. And as you can see, there was pleasingly a significant drop in their injury rates. So from 8 down to 2 in the under 15s and from 7 down to 0 in the under 16s. So I found that athlete monitoring really helped myself and our technical directors to get the message across to our players, across to our coaches, which I believe without these tangible and visible statistics, it would have been made a lot harder to do. So moving on, what did I decide to measure and why? The key here for working with youth players was to absolutely keep it simple. We used the already established wellness questionnaire on the app, as we found it easy for the players to understand and was quick to fill out. In regards to the training logs, and in addition to the measurements that were already set within them, so the training difficulty and the enjoyment ratings, we additionally asked players to rate how hard they felt the session was from a cardio or whole body perspective, and then how hard they were working through their legs only, as they're doing a lot of running and short, sharp sprints throughout soccer, as well as technically and tactically how hard the session was. We then also asked the players to rate their performance on a scale of 1 to 10, so 10 being the highest or the best performance. We found the RPEs really helped to give us an insight into the players' ability to rate their internal workloads, and then allowed us to compare this to the set training difficulty intensities that the coaches were setting. So it also allowed our coaching staff to gauge how hard our players thought a training session was from a physical perspective, or if mentally it was more challenging, so was it technically or tactically a harder session. The addition of the performance rating gave us also further insight into how our players felt they had performed, and allowed us to see how this lined up and matched with the other RPE scores that they were providing us with. When downloading and analysing player data off the app, the most important measurements we like to look at within the Excel spreadsheets or graphs was their daily wellness scores, to see if there were any unusually high ratings for measures such as their fatigue, muscle soreness, sleep quality, quantity, stress levels. These are all the things that the daily wellness questionnaire we were using focuses on. And then in regards to the training logs, we looked at their enjoyment ratings, and if these were quite low, we'd like to see in the comments section if they commented exactly on why, or we'd question the player about it during the next training session. We also compare the coach's planned versus the player's reported training difficulty and training intensities. So if these were continually unbalanced and inconsistent with each other, myself and the coach would discuss this further with the players to try and gain some sort of understanding of why they were either constantly rating training intensities as either being too hard or not intense enough. And finally, at the end of each week, we looked at our players' total weekly training loads and wellness data, which has helped us to select players who are preferable for promotion to older age groups on the weekends. Here we obviously took into consideration any players who also had reported injuries, what their app compliance rates were, as well as how hard they how well they had performed at training through the week. So Don't think the app was a be-all and end-all. There were absolutely external factors that we considered, but the app really helped us to make an educated decision in regards to who was physically okay to be promoted. So in saying that, I'd like to show you an example graph of what our under-13s data looked like for 1 week throughout the season. So as you can see here, we like to look at this data and give them an understanding, and gives the coaches an understanding of, number one, who's been compliant, potentially who has had injuries as well, and if they're available. So their total weekly training load is on this first slide, and on the second slide this is their wellness data. So as you can see, bordering towards yellow, anything above 60% is sort of considered starting to become a bit of a concern. Luckily, most players were sort of well below this line. And at the bottom here, I've written who was available based on both their training log data, so their total training log load through the week, as well as what their injury data was indicating as well. And down the bottom, for those who weren't selected, I also gave the courtesy of the coaches the reason why they weren't selected. So as you can see, some had just quite high training loads from extra training they were doing throughout the week, or had poor wellness scores, or had injury concerns. So there are about 4 players that I haven't included in this, and that was because they just didn't provide us with enough statistics or enough data through the week for me to make an informed decision. Okay, so app challenges. One of our biggest challenges throughout the entire season was in maintaining player compliance rates. Despite continuous reminders from myself and the coaches at training, and through emails providing step-by-step instructions on how to record the data, for the first 3 months, compliance rates only ranged anywhere between 13 to 57% on average, between the under-13s to under-16s. So the under-16s were actually the least compliant, the under-14s were actually the least compliant, with the team average only being 13%. As a result, I held an interactive app tutorial, as I mentioned previously, where we got the players in with their smart devices, so whether or not it was their phones or their tablets, and took them through a step-by-step instructional session where they were encouraged to follow on as I demonstrated how to use the app online. Pleasingly, this resulted in a spike in compliance rates from 51 to 89%. Unfortunately, however, this gradually began to decline again after 4 weeks. So in my last-ditch attempt to boost compliance, I decided to activate SMS reminders to players 30 minutes after training or games. So they'd receive a text message if they hadn't completed their training log for the day. And if they still failed to fill it out despite receiving the text message, a couple of hours later, we got their coaches to send an email out to their parents and encourage their parents to remind their son to complete their log for the day. Thank God this seemed to do the trick. And finally, for the last 2 months of the season, our compliance rates boosted from a team average of 65 to 110%. And this 110% was through the under-13s, and I guess you're wondering, how is that possible? It's because they were recording a lot more of their own unplanned sessions, so their average was boosted beyond what we were asking them to complete and fill out. Finally, also of concern from a coaching point of view was the variation seen between planned training difficulties and the workloads that the coaches had set versus the reported intensities and the loads the players were actually recording. The problem here was twofold, in that this was a result of a lack of both player and coach education. So consequently, I started educating the coaches further in how to set their training loads based on what type of session was being performed. So was it a technical session? Was it tactical? Was it a conditioning session, or was it a game? And how the RPE ratings would differ based on, you know, what sort of session was being performed. In regards to the players' reported intensities, I found more than overestimations of workloads. There was a number of players who were continually underrating their training sessions. So to help in correcting this, myself and our technical directors would assess the coaches' training sessions first to see if there were, you know, if they were disjointed through extended rest breaks, or had they spent too much time talking to their players in between or during drills. And this often actually turned out to be the case in some instances, and once the coaches were given a little bit of a heads up and made aware of it, player reported intensities begun to improve. For those players who, however, were still constantly underrating their loads, myself and the coach would then talk to them and try and get an understanding of their internal workload perceptions. There were, however, a handful of players that, regardless of everything we tried, they either still struggled with the workload concept or just felt they weren't physically being pushed hard enough at training. And this was due to varying fitness levels within teams. So we tried our best to challenge these players where possible on an individual level. So moving on to just some app results. What I'd like to show here is the difference in compliance rates. So pre and post interventions. So pre holding the interactive tutorial with the players and activating the SMS reminders in the second half of this season. So as you can see, player compliance rates in the second quarter was quite high. This is also the same story for the coaches once player data was fed back to them regarding injury rates and player comments. So yeah, you can see these boosted quite considerably across both the players and the coaches. And in regards to here, I know this slide looks a little bit busy. Please don't be too concerned here with the raw values on the left side of each page. Just look more at the percentages for each. And again, hopefully you'll see here that with education on setting training loads for the coaches and then discussing with players a little bit more in regards to how to rate their internal workloads, there was a considerable improvement in the planned versus reported training difficulty and training load accuracy for each team. So essentially this meant that the difference between what the coaches were setting and what the players were reporting had improved. So it gave us more accurate data. And down the bottom here, the subjective data analysis in the bottom table shows a summary of enjoyment ratings. So these ratings were scaled from 1 to 9 instead of 1 to 10. And then also what the average was for the training technical and tactical difficulty. And considering on average this was rated at about a 6 to 7 out of 10, we were quite pleased with these results. But there's definitely room for improvement, and we'll try and boost these numbers even further next season. So moving on, future developments. So moving into 2018, we at Football South Coast are looking to expand the use of the app to our girls and seniors programs, which means we will go from having 64 players on the app to over 160, potentially even 180 if we include our under 12s academy team as well, which consists of 20 players. We will also be utilising more of the media sharing module, which was only introduced to the app as an update late into our season, and will allow us to share video links, documents and photos with our players and coaches. We will additionally look to record our pre-season and in-season testing results on the app, so they are easily accessible and viewable to our coaching staff at any time. The app is also able to generate graphs for testing results and rank the players within our teams automatically if required, based on their assessment data, which we believe will come in really handy. We will also look to upload individual player prehab programs on the app and set up our team physiotherapists with accounts so they can directly go in and add their own treatment notes and any prescribed recommendations or exercises for injured players. Finally, we are also considering setting up an app compliance rate, a minimum app compliance rate for our players to ensure we don't encounter the same struggles that we faced this year. So for example, it may be that we expect the players to maintain a 60% compliance rate, and if this isn't sustained, we may start to limit a player's game time on the weekend until it improves. I know this probably sounds a little bit extreme or harsh, but I think this really helps to demonstrate just how much myself, our coaches and our technical directors at Football South Coast have valued the information that Athlete Monitoring is providing us with. So moving on, what have the players personally thought about it? Based on player feedback in regards to the app, on the whole it's been very positive, with the majority recognising the benefits of monitoring their workloads and wellness. The players have also really enjoyed the ability to share their feedback in regards to training and game day performances, especially when the coaching staff have directly acted on this information. This has allowed them to feel as if they've had a greater input into their own training and development, which is something we highly encourage at Football South Coast. We believe that communication works two ways, and we as coaches are always open to discussion with our players on how to improve our program or get their feedback that allows them to get the most out of our sessions. There were, however, a handful of players that initially stated they didn't see the point of using the app. That was to be expected. Obviously, you can't please everyone, but I believe this perception changed throughout the season once they saw just how much we were engaging in the use of the app and the emphasis that we placed on compliance. The production of an end-of-season report also allowed the players and parents to see exactly what we had used the app for throughout the season, and depending on their results we were able to provide them with more informed recommendations from a player welfare and monitoring perspective. And moving on, coach feedback. So with regards to our coaches, where they found the app particularly useful was with the data that was generated by players for training session difficulties. This allowed them to analyse if their sessions were too difficult or not difficult enough. And so it put onus on the coaches, and those that were willing to take on board, take that information on board, found it really beneficial. And if there were any players who perhaps didn't reach the intensity that was expected of them, and then the coach would investigate that further with the player to try and grasp an understanding of why. Coaches also appreciated the comments that the players were providing regarding training sessions. This allowed them to see what the players took away from the session and gave them a platform to provide positive or constructive feedback in regards to what they did or didn't like about training. Being able to view player enjoyment ratings has also been very important for us, especially given the age groups we're working with. We absolutely want to do our best to ensure that not only our players are learning, but they're also enjoying themselves at the same time, especially at this level where there's a high rate of, teenage years, there's a high rate of dropout as a result of not enjoying the sport any longer. And finally, our coaches have appreciated being able to view, as I mentioned before, total weekly training loads, which has allowed us all to make more informed player promotion decisions on game days. So almost sort of just wrapping up, I wanted to provide you guys with some do's and don'ts in regards to athlete monitoring. Number one, what I found the most beneficial, please do ask questions. What I've found incredibly beneficial in the past year has been Francis and Richard and their whole team of app designers' patience and generosity in wanting to work with me when I've either had questions, which initially, trust me, there was plenty, and then also their willingness to take on board suggestions for potential upgrades on the app, which have helped me utilise athlete monitoring in ways that I've wanted to. For me, this has been such a huge contributing factor to what has impressed me about athlete monitoring, aside from the data it has provided us with. In dealing with Francis and Richard, I've come to learn that not only do I have absolutely the technical support I need, but behind the scenes, we are really backed by professionals who are just as passionate about what they do as what I am about my own work within football. And for me, that's something that I really appreciate. So in regards to educating players, do absolutely try and do this with practical demonstrations as soon as possible. I think had I done this earlier throughout the season, I would have gained player and coach buy-in a lot quicker. And as mentioned previously, try as best as you can to keep players updated with regards to the data they are providing, and give examples of when the app has helped to implement practical outcomes or solutions for your players. This made our athletes feel more engaged in their own individual and team development. If you are a head coach or a technical director, trying to provide your other coaches and your other coaching staff with feedback in specific regards to their team is helpful. So as you can see there, in regards to compliance rates, are their planned versus their reported training difficulties and loads similar? And if not, look into why and how these can be improved. Their team enjoyment ratings, which I've touched on previously. And also, what does their players' wellness and injury data look like? And again, depending on these results, how can these potentially be improved upon? And finally, be patient. I know firsthand how challenging it can seem to be, especially when getting started, but I promise you, I've found with the potential data that the app can provide you with and has provided me with has definitely been worth it. So don'ts, finally just starting to sort of wrap up now. Don't make it complicated. Like I said, keeping it simple is the key. Know what measurements or metrics are going to be of most benefit to you, and focus on the basics. Next, don't expect player and coach buy-in and compliance to happen overnight. Again, this takes time. You may find whether or not you're working with a little bit more old school coaches that they might be resistant to sort of new technology, but please be persistent. Like I said, I managed to get 2 coaches on board, once I was able to feed data back to them, and give up or get frustrated. So like I mentioned before, you're not alone. Francis and his team are always willing to answer questions and provide assistance. So that's, before I finish, that's pretty much it from me, guys. But what I would like to do is just show you quickly one of the end of season reports that we generated for our players. So each of our 64 players got this report at the end of the season, which gave them a total summary of their app data throughout the season. So as you can see here, this was over a total of 230 days. The amount of sessions planned over that duration was 119. This player, because he did a lot of extra other training and he was actually an academy player and quite elite, he recorded 235 sessions. So his return rate was quite high. Like I said, that it went over that 100% because he was recording so much of his own training as well. He missed 21 of our training sessions. So his compliance rate, purely in regards to Football South Coast, was he missed. So he only did about 99 sessions out of 119, or sorry, 98. These were his average RPE difficulties. So this was, the team average RPE. This was his reported RPE, and again, this is low because, like I said, this player was quite elite and above the rest of his teammates, or you know, a little bit more skilled. This was his average enjoyment rating out of 9. This was the average planned load for each session. This was what he was reporting, which is actually not too bad. And these were his average RPE ratings for cardio, legs, technical and tactical, as well as performance. And that's just that same information presented in graph form. And again, the daily wellness averages. So here was his average scores throughout the season for fatigue, soreness, health, sleep quality and quantity, and stress. So like I said, anything below 60% was sort of considered optimal, and he did quite well throughout the season here. The total wellness score percentage, again, this is just that information graphed. And finally, what will probably give you a good insight is this is his total season's weekly training loads. So you can see how much this spiked with his other training commitments. And these red dots are down here are reported injuries. So anything below this yellow, anything below this line and this yellow spot here on the graph showed that he wasn't, you know, his freshness score wasn't ideal. And as you can see here, it's sort of around these areas where he's started to sustain injuries. The good thing is, once we sort of got on top of this and we knew a little bit more about what we were doing, and he had a big spike in his training load here, we were able to monitor his training loads at Football South Coast a lot better and manage him through it, and then gradually increase it again. And as you can see, even though his freshness scores weren't perfect, we prevented any further injury from occurring. And just a summary here, like that looks like a lot, but that's me just summarising for this player all that data. So, you know, we've mentioned that his app comments, which I haven't included here, showed he had a high level of understanding in regards to playing positions and team roles, as well as what strengths and weaknesses were of his game day performances. And then I've also just summarised that graph above down here as well. So guys, that's pretty much it from me. What I'll do is now hand over back to Richard. And if you do have any questions, please don't hesitate to contact myself, Richard, or Francois at the email addresses seen on your screen. We're happy to provide you with any further assistance as much as possible. Okay, thanks very much. I appreciate you taking the time to listen, and bye for now.